The world in which the BBC operates has changed dramatically. Viewers and listeners have unlimited choice and are ruthlessly discerning. Today's guest, the IEA Senior Academic Fellow Professor Philip Booth, argues that the BBC funding model needs to be pulled into the 21st century. The UK has a long history of successful mutuals and cooperatives, Philip argues, that are popular with their members. Such an ownership model for the BBC would be fit for purpose in the modern broadcasting world, detach the BBC from the state, and promote real diversity of corporate structures in the world of media. A remodelled BBC could better leverage its brand internationally and be a commercial success, as well as perform other, less overtly commercial functions that its member viewers value. Okay, so Philip, I want to start by saying, I don't know if you agree with this statement or not, but Britain is lucky to have the BBC, right? For all its flaws, it's an astonishingly powerful global media brand with an extraordinary back catalogue. So is there any reason why a reinvigorated, liberated corporation couldn't take on and beat the likes of Netflix, the US giant, helping to reinvent content for the digital age and perhaps even conquering the world?
Well, we hope that no one media organisation will conquer the world. I don't think that would be very good for the world of media.
World domination.
Yeah, I don't think that would be very good for the world of media or anything else. And yes, of course, in a sense there is a sense in which we are lucky to have the BBC. But then if you give £4 billion or so a year to any organisation, it's bound to do something good with it. Indeed, you could argue that it's maybe £7 billion if you take into account the free spectrum and so on. So the BBC has had a virtual monopoly for much of its life. It's then operated in a world with limited competition, but now it's in a world with competition with lots of other good suppliers of media of all sorts of different types, which in many ways seem to be producing content which is actually better and more highly respected than that which the BBC produces. There are areas, of course, where the BBC is highly respected, and it could leverage its brand, I am sure, as an organisation by itself and perhaps in partnerships with others, to really make it a force across a number of areas of entertainment and media over the next 20 or 30 years. But if it's constrained by a model of state ownership, I don't think that will happen.
Mm-hmm. So the BBC's audience is becoming increasingly narrow, which is something that you highlight in the paper, in your paper, with a perceived white middle-class southeast bias. You hear a lot about BBC bias, but it seems to be from both sides of every argument, whether that be left and right, whether that be Brexit, for Brexit or anti-Brexit. So how much do you agree that there is a genuine bias in the BBC?
I think there is a bias in the BBC, but of course there's a bias in all media organisations. And what one wants really is not every organisation to try to be objective in everything it does, because that will be impossible, nor indeed to try to be totally balanced necessarily in everything it does. But what you want is media pluralism. And you hope that within a pluralistic environment, many media organisations will always reflect a range, a balance of points of view. I don't think this is something that needs to be regulated by the state, and I think a remodelled BBC would be in a position in the broadcasting landscape where it could develop content which was widely respected across the political spectrum. But there's no doubt that it is perceived to be left-leaning. There seems to be some really serious academic work which suggests that it has an intrinsic bias, despite the fact that it does go to great efforts, I think, to be balanced. But that's deeply embedded in its the potential for bias, I think, is deeply embedded within its DNA. But also, interestingly as well, seems to be more and more appealing, relatively speaking, to white, older, middle-class audience. And interestingly, in a recent report, the BBC had quotations about how respected the BBC content was in front of black and Asian ethnic minority individuals. But when you looked at the figures, actually the respect for the BBC amongst black, Asians, ethnic minorities was much less than it was amongst older white middle class people. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because there is great cultural diversity within those communities. There are hundreds of television channels, hundreds of radio channels, and a real vibrant arts and culture scene, which provide people from different backgrounds with the kind of entertainment that they want.
So then, if there is this bias, and there is that academic research to suggest there is at least a left-leaning bias within the BBC, why should we all be coerced to pay the licence fee?
Well, even if there wasn't a bias, I don't think we should be coerced to pay the licence fee. But I guess it's even worse that we're coerced to pay for things that we don't actually believe in. We can choose whether we buy The Guardian or the Daily Telegraph, and we should be able to choose whether we watch BBC or Sky News. Not that there's any great difference, I don't think, between the biases of either nationalised or privatised fully commercial media organisations, but it's I think a general principle that we shouldn't be forced to pay for things unless there is a very, very good reason. And in the 21st century, I don't think there is any very good reason why we should be forced to pay for the BBC.
Mm-hmm. Now, like other cooperatives and mutual organisations, the members would elect its board, and this National Broadcasting Trust that you propose could have fully charitable and fully commercial arms for different purposes. So is this not also at risk of being filled with those that hold the same biases that currently plague the BBC?
Well, I'm an economist, and I'm not really interested, except in passing, if you like, about what the biases of private organisations are. I'd like to see a world of institutional pluralism, but the interesting thing for me as an economist is what is the right economic model for the BBC. And I think in the 21st century, when it is possible to exclude people from watching television channels in the way it wasn't until at least the 1980s, although that's arguable, and where the economics of the broadcasting market have changed in many other ways, I think the case for the BBC not being a subscription model is a very, very now a very, very weak case. And so the BBC should move to a subscription model, and those who don't wish to pay the subscription can watch either other subscription channels or channels which are free because they're paid for by commercial advertising.
Now, your report also proposes the BBC would lose its legal privileges and be treated in the same way as all other news and media organisations for competition purposes. How would that work?
Well, currently there are various exemptions which are given to the BBC, some of them to the BBC specifically, some of them de facto because of it's a public service broadcaster under European Union definitions. So I'm really just saying that the BBC should be treated like any other organisation. So it would be a subscription channel, it would be a mutual owned by its subscribers, that's the suggestion. That would embed diversity into the media sector, which is obviously something the competition authorities are worried about. It couldn't be taken over either by the state, and it couldn't be taken over easily by any fully commercial entity, because the built into its corporate governance would be the mutual model of ownership, where each member had one vote and part ownership of the BBC. And given that would embed diversity into our media, we could actually worry rather less about other aspects of broadcasting and media competition as well. So we worry about the dominance of, say, Sky and the Murdoch ownership of newspapers. Well, here you would have this very large entity which couldn't be effectively taken over by a fully commercial company, which has quite a wide reach when it comes to news provision, has a very well-read website, which is, of course, the main competition these days with newspapers. So there'd automatically be much more competition in the market with independent institutions, independent of the state, than there currently is now. And I think much less need for competition regulation in this sphere.
Do you think then, Philip, that we'd see, I think a concern for some people would be that we would see a loss of radio stations and television stations that the BBC currently has on air, because the BBC would lose revenues from its coercive teletax or licence fee. So could it, for example, instead expand aggressively abroad via internet-based subscriptions? Because it currently doesn't do that. You know, Netflix, Amazon Prime, all of those other alternatives.
So the one thing that the BBC is able to do abroad, which it can't do in the UK, is carry advertising. So it gets some revenue from that source. Once it becomes a subscriber-owned mutual, subscription-funded subscriber-owned mutual, the BBC could then set its subscriptions as it wished in order to raise revenue, but also to widen access as well to those groups who may not be able to, say, afford a fully fledged subscription in the way that all charities and mutuals actually tend to work. So it could have higher subscriptions overseas if it wished to do so, if it felt that there was stronger demand overseas. It could have lower subscriptions in low-income countries if it felt that that would maximise revenue because people would be willing to pay less. Any subscriptions it got from overseas would be, of course, an increment to revenue as compared with the current situation. It could have online-only subscriptions, which students might want to avail themselves of. So there's a whole that the BBC would have to think commercially about all their sources of income and how it used the subscription model to ensure that it did have a reliable source of income, which perhaps may well be even greater than the licence fee.
So with a new globally minded and competition-focused National Broadcasting Trust, how much control would UK subscribers actually have?
Well, one of the interesting things about mutual corporate governance models is that the owners maybe lack the kind of control that they have in a shareholder-owned company. So in a shareholder-owned company, even if shareholdings are quite widely dispersed, there are various mechanisms whereby there are strong incentives on the shareholders to participate, at least in some way, in the governance of the company, electing directors and so on. And, of course, there's always the discipline of the takeover. If a company is not performing well, it can be taken over by another company, which can then take a controlling interest and manage the whole company and take total control. Now, in any mutual, the National Trust is a charity, so that's possibly not the best example, but if you take a building society such as the Nationwide or the Yorkshire Building Society or something like the Co-op, the membership is very, very dispersed, and the membership struggles to really tightly control the management of the company. Now, that works actually as a model when in those areas where you want institutions to be conservative. And I suspect that the subscribers to the BBC would want the BBC to be relatively conservative in terms of its business model. And mutuals were incredibly successful as corporate organisations between, say, the 1850s and the 1980s and 1990s, and popular with their members, actually. And people feel that they actually get, even if they can't really control the organisation, members of mutuals do actually feel as if they do own something, that they are members of something, and that is valuable in itself.
So would you, I think this is quite an interesting question actually, and I'm interested in what you have to say about this. Would you support the UK government being able to decide what sort of TV programmes, if any, it wants to encourage and subsidise, and the whole media industry being invited to bid for contracts?
So this was really the idea of the Peacock Committee back in the mid-1980s, that you should have something like an Arts Council for the Air, whereby an organisation would have funds available for public service broadcasting use, and radio stations, TV channels could bid for those funds and put on programmes which had public service elements. So classic Classic FM, for example, could bid for such a fund in order to promote particular programs which had a public service element. I don't think that is any longer necessary. Actually, there are so many TV channels which fulfilling different interests, many of them really quite educational, and an educational television channel or radio station these days through the internet or satellite television can actually reach a global audience. So you can get decent economies of scale producing good quality educational output, even if the domestic audience is quite small. Mm-hmm. So National Geographic, for example, has a huge number of viewers worldwide. There are niche television programs in the religious sphere which are really quite educative, in the arts sphere and so on. Again, but they may be niche and have a small audience in an individual country, but globally they're able to build up a big enough audience to be to get economies of scale. In addition to that, barriers to entry now to program production and content broadcast are really quite low. The fixed costs of broadcasting are not what they used to be. So I actually don't think it's necessary anymore for the state to subsidise directly public service broadcasting. However, and this is an important qualification, broadcast content, radio content and so on, might be a way in which the government achieved other objectives. So universities might partner, or agencies substantially funded by the government. So universities might partner with a broadcaster, the BBC or another broadcaster, to produce online material for their students, which might then be broadcast more widely. Or the Arts Council might have theatres partnering with a broadcaster to fund productions which were both put in the theatre and broadcast on the radio as well. So in other words, broadcasting might become a means or a medium of achieving other public policy objectives in the educational cultural sphere. But I don't think any longer we need a public policy box which has broadcasting written on the outside of it.
Yeah. And actually, your point about barriers to entry leads me quite nicely onto my next question. So, if we take the BBC's website, in no other sector of the economy would a subsidised taxpayer-financed body be allowed to dump so much free content on the market without falling foul of the EU's competition rules. Yeah. Isn't it time to level that playing field?
Yes, and the removal of legal privileges would in effect do that for the BBC. So I would propose that exactly the same rules apply to the BBC as to other organisations. Now we can argue about the extent of cross subsidies of different activities which ought to be legal or illegal. Of course, there are many cases in relation to that type of thing which the European Commission take up with large tech companies. But the same rules should apply, I think, to the BBC as to apply to any other entity. And if other entities are not supposed to cross-subsidise their website, say, with income that generate through other activities, then the BBC oughtn't to be able to. We can be more relaxed about these things, of course, if the BBC is actually operating on a subscription model where people are freely choosing to finance the BBC, than if the BBC is funded by the taxpayer and putting other companies out of business as a result of the use of its website. Because
it is a massive barrier to entry, isn't it? The fact that it has this, it's able to just dump this content without actually having to really work for it.
Yeah. It's not only a barrier to entry, but it's competing with commercial organisations, including commercial news organisations, such as local newspapers and so on, who have to have that much more advertising on their website because the viewing figures are less. And because of people using the BBC to get regional news.
Yeah. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that if they're actually choosing to do that. But the fact of the matter is the BBC's share of the market is, we're all paying for it, etc. Now, to end, Philip, I wonder if you could just sum up how scrapping the licence fee and creating a national broadcasting trust would put the BBC on a sustainable path and remove its outdated model.
Yeah. So the BBC should be free to pursue sources of revenue which given the modern media landscape, would come from both potentially from the website, international viewers, and those watching content on the internet, and it should be free to pursue those sources of revenue really without any restrictions, and it should be free in its governance and commercial model to adapt to the rapidly changing commercial landscape, which, because its mission is set out and the rules which govern its mission are set out in a charter which is embodied in law, it doesn't have the freedom that it ought to have. Now, the question for me really is whether or not that should be a model of full commercialisation with a shareholder-owned company. My view is actually that's not what BBC viewers want, and if they could make a choice between full commercialisation and some kind of membership model, I think they would choose a membership model, thus perhaps embedding what might be regarded as the best aspects of the BBC, quality and conservatism, together with commercial freedom and the ability to exploit new markets.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Philip.
Thank you.
Now, you can check out Philip's report on the IEA website, and you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Podbean.